All right, we are back with the Lineup Podcast. I'm Dave Prodan, here with my part-time co-host for this season, Mitchell Salazar. The penultimate stop on the 2024 WSL Championship Tour season, the VIVO Rio Pro presented by Corona, completed last Friday with San Diego's Katie Simmers and Bahia Formosa's Italo Ferreira taking home the event wins, heading into the tour's July Olympic break. And then the final event of the regular season, the Corona Fiji Pro in August, that will determine the WSL Final Five who will compete at September's world title deciding Lexus WSL Finals. The waves last week at Italo, they were a challenge. And when it's challenging for the world's best surfers, you know it's tricky because those ladies and gentlemen, they can rip in virtually anything. That said, the final day was relatively cleaner and there were some fireworks from the CT Elite. Mitch, good morning to you. Where do we find you today, and how did last week go down for you from your vantage point on the sands of Saquarema?
Yeah, morning, Dave. Still in Saquarema here today. We're leaving tonight, heading back to LA. But just an awesome event. Really excited every time I come back to Brazil, and I think this is one event that really strikes close to my heart, just because as a lad of myself, being from the area, it's really important to be able to showcase a lot of the talent we see here, especially from the local surfers. Italo winning his first major event right here in Brazil is an epic moment for him. He's won 2 out of the last 3 events on the Championship Tour schedule. Awesome to see Katie go back-to-back and really smoke Sorry Limblad in the final too. But the most impressive thing is always just the crowd and the fans. You know, those people really show up day in and day out. Even if it's an off day, they're still here to support their best surfers and their favorite ones too. And I'm just really excited to be part of it once again. And I'm stoked to be able to go to the next event in Fiji and see what the outcome is going into the Lexus WSL Finals too, Dave.
Right on. Yeah, we have to say, like, the crowds in Brazil are always outstanding, and it's been that way forever. Back when we were in Santa Catarina, when we were at Barra da Tijuca, at Postinho, in Rio proper, and in Saquarema, it's just tens of thousands of people every day. They love their surfing, and it's really cool to see how that kind of energy impacts the performances. But Mitch, let's get into it. Let's hit our opening segment of winners and losers from the VIVO Rio Pro presented by Corona. Who do you have first up for your losers?
Yeah, it's a pretty easy selection. It's Jack Robinson on the men's side. He loses in the round of 16, gets an equal 9th place, has never been able to really have major success here in Brazil in the past. And despite his wife being from the area, Dave, it just seems like it's still a venue where he hasn't been able to connect with the waves so far. And it's really interesting because you look at his free surfs, you look at the way he competes in these kind of heavy waves, you'd be thinking that it's a favorite stop of his. But as of right now, unfortunately for him, it hasn't been so far in the 4 years that he's been on the World Championship Tour. Luckily for him, though, he's still number 3 in the world. Obviously, one of the favorites heading into Fiji, too. He had an amazing training camp there last year with Iago and Joao, just as a welcome trip with Leandro Dora, his coach, too. Really excited to see him not only compete in Tahiti for the Olympics, but also heading into Fiji with a spot on the line for the Lexus WSL Finals. I think he has a very, very big chance of winning over there at the last event of the year. And as of right now, him and Italo are the only 2 people on the World Championship Tour on the men's side that are looking for win number 3 in 2024.
It's a good one, and I think that the commentary on Jack Robinson, especially when he was younger, he was this like preternaturally talented tube rider and heavy water kid, from coming from Western Australia, the things he was doing at Sunset Beach and Pipeline in Hawaii, the things he was doing at Teahupo'o and Tahiti. And I think the criticism of him coming up, you can call it so much, is like, well, how does he do in sort of civilian waves? How does he do in everyday conditions? How does he do performance surfing wise outside of these really critical kind of waves? And I think your point's right. I think his connection with Brazil, obviously his beautiful wife, Julia, and their family they're building, his coach, Leandro Dora, I think that has helped him round out his ability, and he has become this comprehensive kind of surfer on tour. It's a good one, though. That hasn't translated to the CT in Brazil yet for him. But I'm with you. I'm looking forward to seeing how he does in the Olympics, how he does in Fiji, and if he secures that spot for the Final Five at Lower Trestles, where we'll get to see if that work on kind of the performance-based surfing pays off for him. My first loser coming out of Saquarema is the wave at Italo. It had a rough performance this year, so that's my first loser. We mentioned it in the intro. These are the world's best surfers, and they can make virtually anything look good and rip in the most dismal of conditions. So when they are struggling, it's rough. You mentioned Jack Robinson. That's the heat that comes to mind for me. It was Jack Robinson's loss to Conor O'Leary in the round of 16. Jack, he is unquestionably one of the more supernatural ocean readers on tour.
Yep.
And he just could not stick a turn. It was lumpy, it was lurching, it was backwashy. And candidly, as a fan, it's hard to watch when the waves are like that. And that's not to say the championship tour shouldn't have an event in Brazil. The country has been a part of the sport since its inception in 1976. The Brazilian CTers absolutely deserve to have a home country event. The Brazilian fans, as we talked about, deserve to have the world's best surfing in their country live. But Italo let us down this year, and so hopefully we have better in the future.
100%. The one thing I will say about this event, in my experience just doing the broadcast for the Championship Tour and being on the QS and doing both jobs on the QS, surfing and doing the beach announcing, this might be one of the lowest scoring events I've ever seen on the World Championship Tour. I saw so many heats go down with less than 10 points, people moving through with 8, 9 points on their scoreline. And not to say that they're not the world's most talented surfers, because they are, but if those people are struggling out there, it's definitely difficult. I think positioning is a big key factor out here, Dave. I mean, we saw many of the top seeds make it into the elimination round after the opening round heats. And on the women's side, remember, 4 of them in the top 5 were eventually in the elimination round. That's pretty incredible. Right. I don't know if I've ever seen that before either. But once again, it's just one of those locations where you need to be very prepared in terms of the equipment you're bringing. Obviously, the boards is a big thing, but fins too. I was talking to Kano about this during one of the free surfs. He was riding, a particular set of fins that was, more prepared for heavier water waves. And when it's small here, it doesn't necessarily have a ton of energy. You need to be ready for anything that comes at you. And I'm just kind of bummed out that we didn't see Italo perform the best it could have, because I think we would have seen a lot better performances by top 5 surfers. And, once again, I think Gabe's one of those people that hasn't been super dependent on the results here in the past, but unfortunately for him, this year was one of those years because he's heading into Fiji where he's been a former champion. He needed a big result and the waves just didn't cooperate, Dave. So bummer on that end, but guess what? At least we got a Brazilian champion once again, and Italo was able to secure his first major victory in Brazil. Transitioning to number 2 on the loser side for me, it's Johanne Defay. Loses in the elimination round. She was just on the cusp of, being number 5 in the world right there. She gets dropped down to number 6. Gabby Ryan has a little over 1,000-point lead above her in number 5 right now. So going into Fiji, a major event for Johanne. She's been able to have success there before at other left-handers, including Uluwatu too, but it's a do or die moment right here for her. We've talked about consistency before, how good she's done, in the last 10 years, the decade that she's been on tour. Outside of 2023, there wasn't a single year where she didn't finish the year in the top 10. That's outstanding. One of the few Europeans that have had major success on the World Championship Tour. But if she wants to make it back to Low Edge, where I think it's a great venue for her too, both equally as good on the right as she is on the left, she needs a big result over there in Fiji, Dave.
It's a great pick. And as you highlighted, one of the favorites to win on the women's side in Fiji in almost any kind of conditions because of her background growing up in Reunion Island and because of her past success on left-hand reef passes. I'm looking forward to seeing how she shows up in Fiji. Second loser for me coming out of Rio is Australia's Molly Picklum, who collected another quarterfinal result and maintained her position at 4th on the CT ranking. So perhaps it's an odd choice for quote-unquote loser, but let me explain. At the start of the season, Molly blew us all away with her performances at Backdoor and Pipeline. She finished runner-up in the opening event. And then she stuck one of arguably the most critical turns ever completed in the West Bowl at Sunset Beach en route to winning that event. She's been elevating her surfing season over season. And after the 2024 Hawaiian leg, it really seemed like she could run away with the year and be a real contender for the world title. Since then, however, a 9th place in Portugal and Bells Beach, which is just getting through one heat at each event. She got a 5th in WA, so that was slightly better. But then post-relegation, with the smaller field and the smaller format, she has not been able to break past the quarterfinals across Tahiti, El Salvador, and Brazil, which again, post-relegation, that's just one heat win per event. And Molly is someone whom, in her own admission, has had mental blocks affecting her performance in the past. There's the oft-relayed story of her from Ballito, where she couldn't even land a floater, so she took up golf or something like that. But what I'm seeing in her results and in her performances since those opening two events of the season, it's alarming if you really banked on her to be a contender for the world title. Hopefully Fiji, it shakes some of the dust off of her and she can finish the year strong and have some momentum heading into the finals should she maintain her spot in the top five. But yeah, I've been surprised at the decline in her results since those first two events of the year.
Yeah, I mean, it's a solid pick. She's had 4 quarterfinal results in a row, which, as you said, aren't bad for somebody who's looking for her first world championship. Like, it's not championship material, And I agree with you. I think the highlight of her so far was not necessarily the heat that she had against Sakura anymore. To me, it was the one turn that she had at Sunset Beach. Like, that blew me out, and I just think the impact of the turn, the size of the wave, like, demonstrated that somebody her size and with her frame was capable of doing that in a major wave and a wave of consequence too. But the lack of consistency, despite being a good result, it's not an excellent result by CT standards. And if you want to be the number 1 or 2 seed heading into the Lexus WSL finals, you need to be getting semifinals or better. And she hasn't been able to do that lately. And unfortunately for her, she might even be losing her placing in the top 3 right now with the next event in Fiji. She needs to get on the roll, and hopefully she'll be able to do it. And somebody very similar who had major success in the first few events of the year, my third loser is Baron Mamiya. And I love Baron. He's a great friend of mine. I've known him since he was a young kid. We call him Backdoor Baron because he's one of the most unbelievable surfers you'll ever see at both Backdoor and Pipeline. After the win at Pipeline, Dave, his 2 best results have been 9th place finishes. At the beginning of the year, we were both super hyped on him for good reason. Like, the kid's one of the most complete surfers on the planet when it comes to barrel riding. Really, only second to maybe John Florence and Gabe. Outside of that, there's not many people that can really beat him in those kinds of waves. But 2 9s for the rest of the year, like, come on. We are hyping you up to be the next big thing coming out of the Hawaiian Islands. You had a major success on the road last year, especially with the cut on the line over at Margaret River. He was able to make it into finals day in 2023. It hasn't been the case this year. And I don't know if it's his boards, if it's just his mentality. He's been a little off to me, Dave.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And interesting, of course, right? Because similar to Molly, had such a spike to start the year. And it wasn't just, these are surfers who are going to perform well in waves like Pipeline and Sunset Beach. As you pointed out, both of them have proven themselves to be very well-rounded and complete surfers. Yep. Rail surfing, progressive surfing, speed, power, flow, tube riding. And it's amazing to see the drop-off on both of them since the start of the season. Third loser for me coming out of Rio is 3-time world champion Gabriel Medina. And perhaps to a more profound extent, the losers are actually fans like me who are really looking forward to a Florence Medina world title bout this season. Mitch, you and I have talked about this before on the pod, but despite the media kind of pitting John and Gabe against one another as the 2 titans of this generation, their peak performances haven't really overlapped in the same way that the Andy Kelly peak performances did in the early 2000s.
True.
Gabe was ascendant first with the 2014 world title, and then John with back-to-back titles in 2016, 2017, Gabe again in 2018 and 2021. But in between, there have been injuries on both sides. There's been sabbatical years and all sorts of things. So we haven't really gotten that head-to-head title battle between them. This season, John has secured his Final 5 spot. He's currently sitting number 1. And as we talked about on the last podcast, heading into Rio, we were discussing the 3-way knife fight between Gabriel Medina, then 6th, Italo Ferreira, then 7th, and Iago Dora, then 8th, who are all looking to crack into the WSL Final 5. And as you mentioned, Gabriel performed pretty well at Saquarema. He looked strong, he looked sharp, he finished in the quarterfinals, eventually going down to Griffin Colapinto, which is a result. But with Iago finishing runner-up and Italo winning the event, they move up to 6th and 4th, respectively, on the rankings, and Gabriel moves down to 8th, heading into the final event of the regular season. So opportunity lost for him, but Fiji is a venue that Gabriel is one of the favorites, if not the favorite to win. And personally, I cannot think of anyone more dangerous, men's or women's, to end up in the Lexus WSL finals in September. So hopefully we do see something like that happen.
Well, and you know what's crazy about it too is that coming out of the amateur ranks and knowing that Gabe had success at the King of the Groms, he was a world junior champion at the ISA level before he qualified. He went through a rampage on the QS before he qualified too. Like John was still kind of in the shadows, but he was always
Right.
the wonder kid, the prodigy.
Yeah.
And I know they have an overlap, but there's always that debate, who's better? It's
Yeah.
like some people have the discussion of like, hey, I'd rather watch John surf, but the more competitive surfer has always been Gabe. And last year we actually had a debate on one of our episodes, and we talked about who was the better surfer over there in Tahiti. You said that overall, Gabe's the one guy to beat, but I said John just because like he's so much more pleasing to watch.
Right.
But
Yeah.
in terms of the consequences of their performances, I still have to give the upper hand to Gabe just because he's had
Yeah.
a larger impact on the sport. If it weren't for him, I would probably say, and I'll die by the sword right here, Dave, that a lot of those surfers from Brazil, Felipe, Italo,
Mm.
probably wouldn't have the same kind of success because Gabe's had it before them, and he was able to get the mainstream media exposure that everybody deserved back then. And we're fortunate to be able to have him on the CT. I still have him making the finals, and I think it's actually going to be John and Gabe in the title matches over there at the Lexus WSL finals. I'm confident, and I think he is the favorite heading into FIDE. Let's not get super into that though, because it's all hypothetical. We still have one more event to go, and we don't know what's going to happen. But that's what I'm predicting right there. Transitioning into winners, it's obviously Italo. I
Mm.
mean, talk about a bounce back after getting slapped by Brian Perez in the elimination round over there in Punta Roca. He's won 2 out of the last 3 events on the Championship Tour. And I would argue over there in Tahiti, he wasn't the best surfer all event long. He was a consistent surfer. There's a reason
Mm.
why he was able to win, why he was able to overcome John in the final, but he wasn't necessarily the most dominant surfer. Here, he overcame a lot of adversity, Dave. Beating Crosby in the opening round, he had to overcome him when Crosby had the only excellent score of the heat. He needed a 7 right there at the end, was able to get it. The next thing you know, round of 16 onwards, 17.5 heat total. He was able to dominate and just narrowly defeat Iago in a very close final. And guess what? It was kind of the one thing we hadn't seen from Italo all event long. He went right, was able to capitalize on a golden opportunity with a few bangers on that right-hander, fell, and still got the score necessary to overtake Iago. But I just think the way he was able to overcome the pressure and compete at home, having his dad in the crowd, giving him the trophy, and then asking it back over the award ceremonies, it was really cool to be able to presence that. And props to him. He's now in the top 5, and I think after all the crap he's been through the last year, barely making the cut
Mm.
both seasons, it's really awesome to be able to see him get to this point in his life once again, Dave.
Yeah, it's same for me. Italo's my number 1 winner out of Rio. And now, I mean, our winners and losers segment, of course, isn't just intended to reward the results winners of the event,
Yeah.
but rather the subjective and narrative winners in our personal and professional opinions. But I think you said everything right there. Italo has arguably been in a relative slump since his 2019 world title, and he's been
Yeah.
through sponsorship changes. He's had emotional responses to his losses, and he's generally looked a little bit lost on tour himself. But you mentioned it before, Mitch. He is someone who is always redlining either off of espressos or Red Bulls, and that sometimes really suits his performance, but that also sometimes violently offsets the rhythm of the heat for him. And I think what's been positive for Italo over the past few events is that he's won in both, as you mentioned, solid, clean, almost meditative in rhythm surf at Teahupo'o. And then he won last week in manic and frenzied conditions at Itauna, which I think that's a very good range of waves for him to be succeeding in right now, sitting in 4th on the rankings, and he's in good standing to make the Lexus WSL finals at lower trestles and have a shot at the world title. So big winner coming out of Rio for me, and coming out of the last few events.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I want to highlight something too. Out of the 3 people recently from Brazil that have been world champions, only him and Adriano Souza, I would say, are the poorest out of the 4 world champions that they've had so far. Like, he came from nothing, dude. Like, the
Mm.
guy started surfing on a freaking lid of a cooler. Like, that's rad. And then you see the success that he had in a short period of time on the CT. He wins his maiden world championship in his 5th year competing on the championship tour. He's had major success at different venues worldwide, an Olympic gold medal. And I just think the odds that he's been able to overcome are nothing short of spectacular, really beautiful to see. And hopefully he has another chance to qualify for the Lexus WSL finals and maybe compete for world title number 2, Dave.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Who have you got for your second winner, Mitch?
Okay. Second winner, another pretty obvious one. You shouldn't have said that it wasn't rankings based or results based, because my first two are, but it's the two teenage phenoms on the women's side. Caitlin Simmers, Sari Lindblad, dude. I'm such a fan. I think Caitlin Simmers has the potential to become the greatest female surfer of all time. And despite number of world championships, to me, she doesn't need to match Steph. She doesn't need to match Lane Beachley or even Carissa. Like, what she's been able to do in 2 years on the championship tour, just amazing. At her young age, she's maybe 5'3", 110 pounds. She really goes for everything on bigger sections. And once again, the venue she's been able to win at, Bells, defeating Joanna Fay, a much more experienced surfer than her at that venue. Over at Pipe, when she wasn't the best surfer all event long, she defeated Molly in the final. Super Duos last year over Courtney Conlock. And of course, winning back-to-back in Brazil when she's still a teenager. It's radical. Awesome to see. The surfer promotion side deserves a lot of love. She's one of my top winners. And of course, can't forget about Sari Lindblad. She was my pick to win the event. She surfed in the very first heat of the event, made it all the way to the final. Unfortunately, did not have an answer for Caitlin in that final right there. But we talk about consistency as a rookie. Already 2 finals in your first year, Dave. Impressive stuff by the surfer from San Clemente.
I love it. And man, we are really aligned here. I had the Women's Youth Brigade as my second winner coming out of the VIVO Rio Pro. You mentioned Katie and Sawyer. They're both 18 years young. You then have reigning women's world champion and current world number 2, Caroline Marks. She's 22. Brisa Hennessy, currently world number 3. She's 24. Molly Picklum is 21. Gabby Bryan is 22. The average age of the current women's top 5 is 21.4 years old. Wow. And that is a significant piece of evidence in terms of how quickly this generation has taken a hold of the opportunity this season. Right. You mentioned it. Katie has 3 wins to her credit this season at Pipeline, Bells Beach, and Itauna, going back-to-back with last year. And Sawyer, who is a rookie, incredible performance in Teahopu, but also has 2 runner-up finishes to her name in Western Australia and last week in Rio. So huge congrats to both of them. And it's just a really exciting time for women's surfing.
Can I pose the question, Dave? Would all these women be having the same amount of success if Steph and Carissa wouldn't have taken the year off?
It's very chicken and egg, right? Because the counter question is, did they retire / take a sabbatical year because they felt this generational force coming up, right? True. It's interesting. Like, I guess to answer your question and not duck it, no. I think if Carissa and Steph were there, I think just by virtue of their presence and their ability to perform, it mixes up the results in a way where what we're looking at in the top 5 now is not necessarily the top 5 if they're on tour. I'm not saying Steph and Carissa are even in the top 5 if they're still on tour. I'm just saying the results get mixed up quite a lot. But I mean, geez, like Carissa, who has achieved so much in the sport and it has shifted what people believe is possible in surfing, and has done so much for the culture. She steps away. She bows out a pipe early before the significant days, and immediately the young surfers on tour, like, pipes pumping, backdoors pumping, we're going to take the reins and run with it. And they were off, and Steph this year, she's taking a sabbatical year. She's coming back next year. It's going to be one of the major storylines next year of, here's the greatest women's surfer of all time, 8-time world champion. She has achieved so much. She has shifted performance understanding in the water, both men's and women's. Now she's coming back, and there's this new generation of established surfers in the top 5. How is she going to fare? It's going to be really interesting. Yeah, what do you think, though, Mitch? I'm going to ask the question back to you. Do you think that the top 5 look different if Steph and Carissa are on tour this year?
I think Carissa would probably be having consistency once again. I don't know if she'd be the number 1 seed, but I just think experience plays such a big factor in a lot of these venues. But Once again, like the fact that Katie was able to overcome both Molly and Joanne at two of those venues, like to me, impressed the hell out of me. And I
Mm,
think we're just seeing evolution right in the moment too. Like that's one thing that I didn't necessarily see with the previous generation. And I think Brisa leading it right now, being the older one out of these surfers, Molly following right behind her, and then you have the teenagers Sakura Sawyer, and of course Caitlin Simmers. Like I think their adaptability in the moment is just
mm,
something that we probably didn't see with Carissa's generation and the one before that either. So I would say also mixed results, but I would probably think that Carissa, maybe Steph just outside of the top five, but I think Carissa's in the top five conversation once again.
right. Who you got for your
Great.
third and final winner out of
Yeah.
Sacramento?
Great convo, I just want to say right there, because
Yeah,
I need to
yeah.
bring that question up. I think a lot of people are probably asking themselves that throughout this year. Speaking of relevance and opportunity, my third winner and maybe one of my all-time favorite surfers, Jordy Smith,
Mm,
semifinal finish right here in Rio. I can't say enough good things about this guy. He's dedicated to both his platform as a championship tour surfer. He's been one of the most outstanding free surfers of all time. And when it comes to developing and progressing the sport, like the guy deserves a lot of credit, Dave. If it weren't for him and Dane Reynolds, we probably won't be seeing the kind of performances in terms of progression and creativity that we see on tour nowadays. And making the semis, he's just outside of the top five. He's number 7 in the world, and only less than 1,000 points separate number 5 Ethan Ewing and number 7 Jordy Smith in terms of the ranking. So I know Fiji's not a strong suit, but he makes it to lowers despite being, on his 17th year on the championship tour, the oldest surfer on tour, which is just crazy to
it's
say
crazy.
at
Yeah.
36 years. 36 years, and he's the oldest guy on tour. I mean, I'm a 30-year-old now, dude. It's making me feel old right now. But I know Fiji's not a strong point. He's won twice at lowers as a regular CT event, though. And I know in terms of conditioning, he's conditioned well enough to be able to surf 6, 7 heats out there on a regular day. He's my third winner coming out of Rio, and I truly, truly want him to be able to compete for a world championship before he retires, Dave.
You're feeling old, man. I put together the press conference in my former role as a media person, his rookie season on the Gold Coast in 2008. So, I mean, it's one of those things where, and he was always kind of like a pretty smart and funny guy. And he's just kind of this like wizened gunslinger on tour now. And I'm with you. Like he at points in his career has been lights out the best surfer on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And he's had weak spots. He's been open about those,
Yep.
backhand tube riding, places like Teahupo'o, places like Fiji. But in the last few years, I think especially becoming a father, he's taken his fitness so seriously. He's surfing better than ever. And I think if he's able to get a result in Fiji, he's considerably more dangerous at lower trestles, which is a place that he had a house at one point. I'm not
Yep.
sure if he still does, but he has so much experience out there. He's won the CT event there. He and his size and his physicality and his approach to surfing and obviously his talent, he has a point of difference on the canvas at lower trestles that makes him incredibly dangerous. So be interesting to see. Interesting to see how he goes in Fiji. We already talked about the frenzy around those back two spots for the men's final five. We've got the Brazilians fighting. We've got Ethan Ewing fighting. It's going to be really interesting.
Yeah.
My final winner coming out of Rio, and I do what I usually do on this. I get a little bit ahead of myself. But it's two shapers in Chris Borst and Timmy Patterson, who supplied the equipment for the event winners, Katie Simmers and Italo Ferreira. And of course, we're going to dive into the frankly, historic performance of Matt Biolos and the Lost Surfboards program during our upcoming Vissla CT Rankings segment. But I do want to credit Chris and Timmy here because they each have one team rider on the CT this season. And those team riders have collected 3 wins in Katie's case and 2 wins in Italo's case this year. And I think that's just a massive accomplishment for both the surfers and their shapers, and a huge testament to the faith that both Katie and Italo have in their equipment. We know how it goes on tour. Surfers that win, the bigger programs hover, whether it's, wetsuit companies, clothing companies, energy drink companies, board companies, etc. And those bigger programs have a better opportunity to kind of seduce those talents to come to their programs. But In Katie and Italo's case, they've stayed very true so far to both Chris Borst and Timmy Patterson. And the proof is in the pudding. Those boards are working for them, and a huge credit to both shapers coming out of Rio.
Right. And, let's just highlight that a lot of the major shapers and a lot of the major brands nowadays were kind of similar to where both Timmy and Chris Moore started out. They had a smaller amount of riders on their team. They were just able to capitalize on getting those best surfers initially, though, and then they became stars themselves. And because they became stars, the shapers also became more well-known worldwide. And you look at JS, he had major success with Andy, Bruce, and of course Joel Parkinson on his team at one time on the World Championship Tour. But it might just be a generational thing too right now. We're seeing San Clemente become one of the hotbeds in terms of talent right now. And that's why I feel Mayhem's had a lot of success, because he's been able to bring the youth with him on the championship tour as well. And they've been able to get him a lot of strong points. Same thing could be said for Chris Borst, though. I mean, Katie's only 18. If more people see the kind of success that she's had and they eventually want to get on the same boards and the same program, might as well be able to ask. And that's the one thing the one thing I love about shapers in Southern California. There's a ton of them. Tim Stamps, longtime shaper for Courtney Conlog. She had major success on the championship tour, many event wins. We talk about Chris Boris and, of course, Timmy Patterson winning events, 5 combined on the CT this year for both men and women. It's not only a tribute to loyalty, Dave, but more importantly, performance surfing on their surfboards.
Couldn't agree more. Well, that is our winners and losers segment from the VIVO Rio Pro presented by Corona. We're going to take a quick break to get a word in from our sponsors. And when we come back, we're going to dive into the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings update. All right, we are back. This is the Lineup Podcast. I'm Dave Prodan here with Mitchell Salazar, and it's now time for the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings update. Shaper Rankings! A quick refresher for listeners on how we're measuring shaper performance this season. The Vissla CT Shaper Rankings is a combined men's and women's ranking, counting all surfers finishing in the quarterfinals or better. The shapers receive the same rankings points that correlate with their respective surfer finishes. The higher the surfer finishes, the more points that shaper receives. We've been tracking the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings since the opening event at Pipe, and we will conclude at the conclusion of the final regular season CT event at Cloudbreak, and we will crown the CT Shaper of the Year before the Lexus WSL Finals. In addition to being honored the 2024 CT Shaper of the Year at the WSL Awards, the winner of this year's Vissla CT Shaper Rankings is also gifted an overnight stay and surf at the Surf Ranch Lemoore, courtesy of the Kelly Slater Surf Ranch and the WSL. Okay, so when the dust had settled on the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings after the VIVO Rio Pro presented by Corona, it was none other than Lost Surfboards, helmed by Matt Biolos, that pulled out to an astonishing 66,935 point lead over the current number 2 Sharpeye, on the strength of performances by men's and women's runner-ups Iago Dora and Sawyer Lindblad, semifinalists Griffin Colapinto and Gabriella Bryant, and quarterfinalist Caroline Marks. The defending CT Shaper of the Year Lost Surfboards has been the frontrunner on this season's rankings since the Rip Curl Pro Bells Beach. And despite there being a handful of teams in the same program size to start the season, the San Clemente-based Lost Surfboards has effectively been unchallenged since the midway point of the season. Their 66,935 point lead right now is the largest in Vissla CT Shaper Rankings history. And while it's still technically and mathematically possible for the current number 2, and only, to be clear, the current number 2 Sharpeye to catch them in Fiji because there are 97,900 points on offer, it would require drastic moves on significant team acquisitions between them and now, and then they'd have to essentially run the table in the South Pacific, both of which are pretty unlikely. So, Mitch, long preamble, but while we can't officially say that Lost Surfboards went back-to-back on shaping world titles, it is more or less a done deal at this point. Now, you, as a Lost Surfboards team rider and someone who watches equipment performance like a hawk on tour, what do you think are the contributing factors that led to such a strong outing from Lost Surfboards in 2024?
First of all, I want to give a huge shout out to team manager Gian Bernini. He's a local right here from Rio. I think his story is amazing. He actually met Matt Biolos at this event in 2014, 10 years ago. He asked him for a job. He said, I have no experience. I just want to work for Lost Surfboards. Next thing you know, he was able to get a visa, travel to the United States, and he's been the team manager for the last 10 years. He came to this event specifically with a ton of boards for his riders, rented a house, and was able to accommodate everything for their surfers. I don't think if it weren't for Gian, they'd probably have the same amount of success as they do right now. And I need to give him a personal shout out because one of the hardest working men in sports. Also, Yufu Penrose from Team Sharp Eye, he was here all event long. He took great care of his team and all of the people around him too. But I think it's really coming down to the relationship that a lot of these surfers have with Matt Biolos and the rest of the shaping crew over there at the Lost headquarters in San Clemente. Personal relationships, we talk about it, but because a lot of these surfers on their program have been with him for so long, they're just intimate. And it comes down to being able to text your shaper on a daily basis, give him feedback in the moment, and of course, the boards work. You know, they're some of the best boards in the world, and because you have lowers as your backyard, maybe the most high performance wave in the world and one of the most consistent waves on the west coast of the United States too, it's a perfect background to be able to test a lot of these new boards and shapes that they have worldwide. But it comes down to management. And I think Gian Bernini has been at the forefront of that. I think he's done an outstanding job so far in 2024. And because of that, they're going to go back to back with world championships on the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings, Dave.
It's a great call out, and it would be great to get Gian on the podcast in future just to get his insights as a team manager, as well as Yufu Penrose, obviously Brent Powers at Channel Islands. And I think that is such a critical component to building these teams out. You have to have the shapers, you have to have the designs, you have to have the production facilities, you have to have the commitment of quality sanders and glassers, you have to have a business that funds this whole enterprise. But so it's so many pieces that go into this, and I think you're so right to call out the team managers. And look, like, let's look at Lost Surfboards, right? Because attrition happens, right? In the last couple of seasons, they've lost star performers like 5-time women's world champion Carissa Moore and Kalohe Andino from the tour, but the development of their team and the depth of their bench is kind of unimpeachable at this point, and Gian has a huge hand in that. I do want to talk about those other kind of tier one contenders in terms of program size. You know, as we've said since the start of the program, not all board programs are created equal. They can differ in size depending on the scale of their business, as well as just how they're interested in building out their own programs. Some have big teams. As we mentioned, some only have one team rider on the CT. But the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings gives us the opportunity to talk about and celebrate them all. And I think what we've learned the past 2 seasons is that vying for the shaping world title, it's a bit of a numbers game. And the programs that have that kind of upper tier in terms of size, they definitely have an advantage. So let's talk about current number 2, and a program that in the last 5 years has been so celebrated because of how rapidly their team's grown and how important these shapes have become on tour. Sharp Eye, headed by Marcio Zuvi out of San Diego, they started the season with 9 surfers on the championship tour. They had 2-time and reigning world champion Felipe Toledo pull out during the pipeline, pull out from the season, which was a huge blow. They've also had Jack Robinson using quite a lot of Arakawas this season, which he's collected a couple of results on, and that's another huge blow. But Mitch, what do you make of something like Sharp Eye? I mean, they were ahead at one point in the season. What changed for them in terms of just not being able to maintain pace with Lost Surfboards?
Well, I think you knocked it right on the head. I think Felipe's absence right now is really killing them. And it was much more competitive last year because they had just a slightly larger number of surfers. And the success that he's had the last 2 years, especially with his major wins over at Chebe, Punta Roca, and even, of course, making finals day on both appearances over at the Surf Ranch, too. Like, the guy is just one of the keyest surfers you could have on the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings. I also want to say, though, that their women's team has struggled so far in 2024. I know Tati's coming off of a quarterfinal finish over here, a semifinal finish once again here in 2024 at the VIVO Rio Pro. But Joanne Defay has had a couple ups and downs in terms of consistency too, and I think that's really killed them. And I think that's why Mayhem's done so well, because their women's team is just as strong as their men's team. But Sharp Eye, they've obviously had a lot of exposure with the wins of Felipe so far. but he hasn't been able to win the world championship for the Shaper ranking. So that's one thing that he's going to lack. And I think we could say the same thing for everybody else too. Like they've been able to win individual events, but they haven't been able to gather the consistency to be number one in the rankings at the end of the year, Dave.
One thing you mentioned earlier about Lost Surfboards having lower trestles in their backyard, it's interesting to me, right? Because it's a great canvas for developing high performance surfing. It's a great canvas for testing boards, but these surfers travel to a unique array of world-class waves: Pipeline, Sunset Beach, Bells Beach, Margaret River, Punta Roca, Teahopu, Fiji, right? And these are not lower trestles kind of waves. And yet Lost Surfboards has developed equipment, and it seems like their team rider is mostly consistent in using that equipment regardless of where they're at. You contrast that with Sharp Eye. We mentioned Jack Robinson using Arakawas a bit this season, but also, team riders like Leonardo Fioravante or even Kanoa Igarashi using Glen Pang, TNC surfboards when they're in Hawaii. Is that something that you think Sharp Eye will look at moving forward, going, we want equipment that's going to work everywhere regardless of the venue? Or are they kind of focused on a specific type of performance and specific type of waves, and they're comfortable with their team riders using different equipment if they're in different locations?
Well, they're more of a high performance kind of brand, and they're not necessarily a brand that's going to pursue building boards for certain waves like Sunset Beach and Pipe. They're not specific towards that. That's where you want to rely on the Hawaiian shapers. And that's why I respect the hell out of Jack Robinson for being, straight up and forward with Marcio and being like, hey, Eric's my uncle. He makes me boards. And if it comes down to it and I feel more comfortable on his boards, I'm going to use them in those kinds of conditions. No disrespect to Marcio, obviously, because he knows what he's doing. Like, the guy's had major success with Philippe in the past, and Philippe's been able to have success at certain locations that aren't necessarily high performance waves. They're bigger, larger waves, with Sharp Eyes too. Same thing for Tati.
Yeah.
Like, she's never transitioned onto another board, even Joanne Defay too. But like, as a shaper and as a friend, I gotta be cool with them wanting to opt out of using my boards at a certain location when it comes to consistency. Because Dave, and this is the most important thing about it, even if they have success in another shape at that location worldwide throughout the calendar year, which boards are they riding the most? Mine. So that's the one thing. I'm still getting the larger amount of exposure because they're not using them at just one event. They're using that at all of them, and for Marcio, that's been the case the last few years, especially with Felipe winning back-to-back world championships. But just to touch on Kanoa and Leo so far this year, they've obviously been inconsistent too. Those are two guys in the past few years were top 10 surfers. Kanoa in 2022 was able to be number 5 in the world too. So that's also another key factor for him. He hasn't gotten the same amount of exposure because they haven't done super well in 24 either.
That's a good point. Let's move on to DHD, Darren Hanley Designs, out of the Gold Coast of Australia. DH, he's been on the podcast before. He's hyper competitive. He's a former professional surfer himself. He has built so many world title surfboards for the likes of Mick Fanning and Steph Gilmore. And he was very adamant that he wanted to contend for the shaping world title this year. And his team at the start of the year, they had 7 to start the season. It was an impressive team. They had Ethan Ewing, Connor O'Leary, Liam O'Brien, Callum Robson, Molly Picklum, Jacob Wilcox, and Isabella Nichols. Now, exclusively Australian, which is maybe a red flag, but second piece of it, it felt like they had contenders at each level. Like, Ethan is a world title contender. Connor and Liam and Callum, they're top 10 contenders, if not making huge inroads into the tour. We talked about Molly Picklum. She is a title contender. I had Jacob Wilcox picked as my rookie of the year. He didn't even make the midseason relegation. And then Isabella Nichols, another one who has consistently performed in the past, but failed to make the relegation point as well. So they had a bit of bad luck, but I do wonder if DH wants to compete, he's going to have to look to diversify with European team riders, American team riders, Hawaiian team riders. And we've talked about in the past, we talked about Jian and Yufu and Brent. I don't think DH has a regular team manager that travels with them. I think often he takes that role himself, which is hugely valuable, but he's a busy person. He has hinted in the past that, Mick Fanning splitting his time between Australia and the home he's building in San Clemente may provide an opportunity for Mick to build out that U.S. program, which would help. And I know it's a bit of a word salad there, Mitch, but your response to how the DHD team has performed this year and maybe where there's opportunities for them moving forward.
Well, it's good to highlight, though, that Jacob Wilcox was probably the key piece right there in terms of the mid-season relegation, because you look at the waves that we got over there in Tahiti, he probably would have been crazy good over there, Dave.
Right.
I was just relishing the opportunity to see him compete in those kinds of waves. Punta Roca, too, long right-hand point break, incredible backhand by Jake, and of course, we can't forget about the beautiful left barrels over there in Fiji. He probably would have been a contender, especially when it comes to Rookie of the Year. Missing a key piece, which is Stephanie Gilmore. She's always had success on his boards. It's just hard to compete with the market in the United States when you already have incredible shapers, incredible programs like Mayhem, like Channel Islands. And I know Marcia's originally from Brazil, but he's really made his bones in San Diego, California, though. We really have to call it an American brand with Brazilian roots. So you're already competing against three of the best shapers in the world, three of the best products in the world, in a market that already has opinions deferred to that. And I know Mick has been traveling back and forth between the Gold Coast and San Clemente, and even Huntington too. I see him every now and then surf over at the pier because his partner's from that area. But I just don't know if that's really the right move for him. I feel like Europe might be a bit of a better move for him, or maybe even in Brazil. Because look at what Jason Stevenson was able to do. If he gets both surfers, Sammy and Miggy, to make the midseason relegation and get more exposure through there, that was what he was expecting and what he was hoping for. He wasn't able to get it. But I think DHD needs to be able to do that. You either move to Europe or you get to Brazil, where you have a major surf and make it past the midseason cut. You get more exposure on the broadcast, Dave. That's really his key to success, I feel.
I like it. That's good insight. Moving on, probably the last program that we'll talk about that is in that broad upper tier in terms of size is Santa Barbara-based Channel Islands Surfboards, helmed by the Britt Merrick. We've talked about their team manager, Brent Powers. They started the season with 6 on tour. They had Zhao Xianca, Baron Mamiya, Matthew McGillivray, Lakey Peterson, Imai Kalani DeVault, and Alyssa Spencer. And they were looking, and I think we talked about this at the start of the season, they were exploring some other pickups. We saw Katie Simmers' brother, Timo Simmers. He's been riding CIs, so we talked about that she could have been a candidate for getting picked up before the season started. We saw Betty Lusakura Johnson testing out some CIs in the offseason. So they were clearly looking to build their team out. And then, of course, Zhao's horrible injury and pulling him off tour didn't help them at all. But, they're another program in the last few years where they're arguably the most successful board program in the history of the championship tour. And they're really looking to rebuild. The shapes are world-class, but the team, even though it was somewhat decimated this season in terms of numbers, also didn't really perform as consistently as they would have liked to.
True, 100% true right there. All facts, because the key piece is Joao Xianca, number 4 in the world last year. That kid was en route to have a successful year. He will be competing at the Olympics, and if he decides to compete over in Fiji, could also make it to finals day, could at least give him some quarterfinal points or better. But I know that they're not necessarily a contender for the number 1 spot when it comes to the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings title. But because Brent's at every event, because Britt's at the majority of events, we see them on camera, we see them on screen, we're always talking about them. So I know he's not going to get the championship in that sense, but he's getting exposure. And isn't that what everybody wants in the end? I know, the yellow jersey is one thing, but we're talking about you. We're talking about your product. And in the end, that's what you're trying to do. You're getting more people to buy your product because you're on camera, you're on screen. And that's why I really appreciate both Britt and Brent, because they're always at every event. They're always giving us info about their team riders and what they're riding. And in the end, we're talking about their product because they're there. And despite them having a smaller team now, you said yes, Joao's absence is obviously killing them when it comes to the rankings on the men's side. We're still talking about them, though, even right now. And they love this, because out of everybody in the shaping world, Dave, especially yourself riding Channel Islands for the most part, they had a big downfall there for a while, especially after Kelly leaving the program, who was their golden boy for 20 plus years. And then all of a sudden, Rick comes back, takes over Channel Islands. Mike Walters doing an incredible job in the shaping bay too. boom, they're on the rise up once again. So give them a few years, let them get a few more riders, and let them get a key piece on the women's side. They're going to be as strong as ever, and I feel like they're going to be a contender for many years to come.
They want that yellow jersey, let's be
Oh yeah,
honest.
hell yeah, hell
But
yeah.
we should say too that since we recorded last, Stab High ran their Japan event, and Channel Islands went for 3 for 3. Eitan Osborne won the men's division. I've drawn a blank on the young kids that won.
Lucas
the
Sankville.
Ladybirds. Thank you. And so Ladybirds, and then the Bottle Rockets. Channel Islands won all 3, and all 3 team riders were on different models, which I thought was pretty cool. So, look, they are building. They're building towards a run at the Shaping World title again, I think. You know, one of the other things I wanted to talk about with regards to the season, yes, Lost Surfboards did start the season with 10 surfers on the CT, but half of them, 5 of them, came off of the Challenger Series rankings last year. So in proof of concept, they actually had the least amount of returning CT surfers from the CT. It was the depth of their field coming up from the Challenger Series in Cole Hauschman, Crosby Colapinto, Eli Hanneman, Cade Matson, and Sawyer Lindblad. So it's worth looking at, because I think as we shift into this phase of the 2024 calendar year, how important is the Challenger Series to the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings? And should we be paying attention to who's performing well on the CS in 2024 to anticipate what's going to happen in 2025? Because it clearly made a huge impact this season on the CT.
We should, because guess who's leading the rankings on the women's side of the Challenger Series? Erin Brooks. Who does she ride for? Lost Surfboard. She won back-to-back Challenger Series events. The one in Saquarema last year to finish inside of the top 10 and get a position to requalify automatically on the CS. Then goes to Snapper Rocks and wins the event there. And now with the Ballito Pro already starting to, dude, I'm just expecting her to be on the CT for 25 already. I think she's going to have a great year when she's able to make it there. And talk about young age. That young lady's not even 17. I'm really excited to see her compete on the CT when she eventually gets there. I think on the men's side, it's more of a mixed bag, but yeah, we should be. It's the feeder system. So eventually all these surfers are going to be able to make it there and have major success with the brands that they opt to choose in terms of that. But once again, I mentioned this earlier in the year, and I'm going to mention it again because I think it's a key piece of information. Myself, a lot of other people on both the QS and the Challenger Series, they still pay for their boards. So if somebody comes up front to them and is like, hey, I'm going to offer you a contract where you don't have to pay a dime for anything, and you're going to get as many boards as you want as long as you do all your media projects with our brand, that's something that I'd be looking out for. And I know Katie probably got an offer like that from multiple brands to start off the year. She declined them all, decided to stick with Chris Borst. And that's where loyalty is a key factor of this. And that's where Erin Brooks is so vital to the success of Mayhem in the future. Because since she's been surfing and since she's had media exposure in the last 6 or 7 years, she's always been on a Mayhem, Dave.
Yep. No, that's a great point. Well, we now have our July break on the CT for the Olympics. A number of CT surfers will be representing their respective countries at the Paris Games, with the surfing event being held at Teahupo'o in Tahiti. And then we are back on the CT for the final event of the regular CT season, the Corona Fiji Pro in August. Mitch, if you're a CT surfer right now, whether you're going to the Olympics or not, what are you doing, if anything, on your equipment in this 6-week gap? Are you dialing in your Fiji quiver? Are you dialing in your trestles quiver if you're hunting a WSL Final 5 spot? Are you putting feelers out for programs for the 2025 season? Lots of free dinners from team managers. What do you think is happening in the team rider shaping space in this 6-week gap?
Well, let's start with the women right here. Katie, Caroline, Brisa, Molly, the top 4 on the women's side, they're going to Tahiti to compete in Paris. Joanna Fay just outside, number 6. Tati, number 7. They're all going to Tahiti to compete in the Olympics, so they have to focus on that wave at Chope specifically right now. I know Sakura is going on a trip, and she's going to be testing out boards, both Pizels and Channel Islands. I know Joe Turpel tried to get on the Timmy Patterson program. I think he's still very enthusiastic about that right now, Dave. I don't know how much it's going to work out, but I think for the people that already have experience still going with the women right now, Katie, Caroline, Brisa, and Molly too, they all have experience competing at lowers, surfing there on the regular. So it's not necessarily an issue for them to get their boards dialed in for that wave. I think the tricky one right here is going to be Fiji because it's a mixture of a barrel and performance wave. But the big thing right there is they can also get huge. And we're susceptible to running on a large day out there. And you need to be ready to charge on a larger board. I'm hoping that everybody brings at least a major step up over there, a 6'6", a 6'8". On the men's side, probably something around the 6'0", 6'2" range for a lot of the women on tour. But I do think that's a venue where, especially after not being there for 7 years, it's going to be a bit tricky for a lot of the younger surfers on tour. Transitioning to the men's side, John's already focusing on lowers. I know that. Him and Ross Williams, his coach, have been doing a lot of great work. The Red Tiger from Vissla, they've been doing some modifications on that board right there, adding in a little bit of extra V on the bottom, a little more broadened tail just to perform a little bit better. And as Kaipo always says on the broadcast, excuse me, he has that little extra swivel on the backhand. You could even see it on the forehand a little bit. Griffin, that kid knows lowers just as good as anybody else. Jack's been there a few years. His boards look good before. He just needs to perform. Italo's been runner-up to the World Championship right there. Ethan, let's not even talk about his performance last year because we could just go down a rabbit hole and talk about how amazing he looked. Look, I think the key person to talk about right here is Iago because he's the most creative surfer on tour. He's radical when it comes to both the air and the rail, and I think he's the one guy to look out for. He's just outside of the top 5 right now. I know he's wanting to look for another win on the CT. He's looking for his first one in 24. It could be over in Fiji. But if that guy makes it lower, so he has the board dialed in, either the driver 3.0 or the sub driver 2.0, he's the one guy to look out for because him and Matt Biolos have a great relationship. He's going to get there as early as possible if he qualifies. And you better watch out for that kid, Dave, because I'm telling you, he makes it to lowers. If you're anybody else on the men's field, you got to be very careful about drawing that guy in the event.
I like it. Well, that was a full-throated Vissla CT Shaper Rankings breakdown following this penultimate event of the regular CT season, the VIVO Rio Pro presented by Corona. We're going to take one more quick break to get a word in from our sponsors, and when we come back, we will answer listener questions.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm your part-time co-host of The Lineup, Mitchell Salazar, here with the Chief Strategy Officer of the World Surf League, David Prodan. Remember, if we don't get to your question this week, we'll do our best to always respond in our DMs. Dave, let's get things started. At Juan C. Ripple, Medina doesn't seem as motivated as in the past. What's up with that? 10 dogs.
What's 10 dogs mean?
I don't know.
Something.
But it's funny.
Well, I mean, look, we talked about Gabe a little bit this podcast already. I mean, it's interesting. I was going to bring this up before because we were talking about John and Gabe, and I agree with you. I do think Gabe has achieved more, both results-wise and maybe performance-wise and probably cultural impact-wise than John has. But one thing I want to add, too, is the media often loves to reduce things to like black and white, like John is the surfer, Gabe is the competitor. But that's so wrong in the case of these two because Gabe is not just like an experienced competitor. Like he, in a lot of ways, has redefined what is possible at places like Teahupo'o, his aerial game, his commitment to fitness, the power of his surfing, his win at really sidewindery, nasty main break Margaret River last year. He from a surfing perspective, has redefined so many things about surfing. And of course, John has too. But John is not just a surfer. He has won a ton. And he is actually a very focused competitor. And he's one of he was one, I haven't been in the room back in 2017, when the concept of the finals was first discussed. He was one of the more adamant proponents of it because he said, I want to know what is inside of me. I want to know how I perform when everything is on the line. I want to win in the water. And to me, that is someone who is kind of operating competitively at a different level. They're competing with themselves. They're competing with the world's best surfers. And so I wanted to bring that up because I think both of them have contributed not just to the surfing part of surfing, but the competitive part. And as it comes to his motivation this year, and going back to the question, look, it's tough. Like, I mean, Gabe is a 3-time world champion. He was the first South American male to win the men's world title. And it was at a time, it was 2014. I remember this vividly. The World Cup was happening. Brazil was supposed to be the odds-on favorite to win the World Cup in soccer. And they got annihilated by Germany. It was this horrifying loss. And I was working in media at the time, and you could measure and watch and experience basically the sporting soul of the entire nation shift its focus away from that loss to this 19, 20-year-old kid who is beating the world's best surfers and en route to his first world title. I don't think that kind of circumstance has ever happened in professional surfing. So he didn't just win the world title for himself and for Brazil. He won it at a time that immediately vaulted him into a national icon status. And it transformed surfing in Brazil forever. And so I bring all that up because this isn't just someone who is surfing better than they ever have, who looks stronger than they ever have, and by all accounts should continue to be winning. This is someone who has already achieved so much in their young career. And so I do think motivation or just navigating expectation management is a big deal for him. And look, I mean, I think he's been pretty vocal about thinking that he's not getting scored correctly or that he is upset at losing to surfers who maybe have not achieved as much as him. But the truth is, the talent level on tour has never been better. Anyone can beat anyone on tour. But I would say, pound for pound, Gabe is still one of the best, if not the best surfers on the planet. So I don't think it's all motivation. I think it's wrestling with all these outside the water components that have maybe taken his eye off the ball a little bit. But it's hard to say because he still seems like he's so focused and dedicated. I just think the tour is harder than it's ever been. I don't know, Mitch, what do you think about Gabe's motivation?
Oh, it's a great way you close out your point right there. It's harder than ever. And I think another big point to bring up is that he's from the best generation of surfers to ever do it too. John, Iago, Philippe, Italo, and they had to go through the best of Kelly towards the end of his, monumental reign too. They had to go against Mick Fanning, against Joel Parkinson still, De Souza, who was a longtime staple on the championship tour, and they've still been relevant when it comes to them making that mid-season cut back then in 2011 when we had the One World Rankings. Let's not forget, he won 2 events in the back end of 2011 when the kid was not even 18 years of age, and the rampage that he's had in 2014 and 2018 and his monumental victory at the first ever WSL finals in 2021 as well. When, I said on the broadcast, I picked Philippe to win that year at the first ever WSL finals. Gabe just slapped me in the face, shut me up, and he went out and did that backflip, remember, in 6-foot surf over at Lower Trestles. Like, it was huge, and I can't overstate the impact that he's had both culturally and globally when it comes to being a superstar in the sport. He can't even walk down the street comfortably here in Brazil without getting mobbed by a pack of fans, Like, the guy's had a major impact both inside and outside of the water, and we owe a lot to him. I think in terms of motivation, it's still there. It's just a matter of fact that he hasn't been able to be consistent this year. And once again, he lost 2 very close heats back-to-back at Bells and then Margaret River. Those could have gone either way. And if those go his way, he's probably having a different year at this point, Dave. So I think it's important to highlight that out. But in terms of motivation, it's still there. He's my favorite to win over in Fiji. So they better watch out with that guy over there at the last event of the season. He will be competing at the Olympics too. And that's actually a perfect segue into our second question. At J Haley 87, will competing in the Olympics give the tour surfers the upper hand going into Fiji? What do you think, Dave?
That's an interesting question. I guess the case for would be that it's a left-hander and a left-hander, so you get some reps going in that direction. I do think, for as much as people like to compare them, they're very distinct waves. Teahupo'o, it's a shorter ride. It is all about the barrel. It's all about positioning yourself and your entry point, your entry speed. The line you set. How deep and how critical can you get barreled at Teahupo'o? And yes, there are obviously barrel sections out at Cloudbreak and restaurants, but it's such a longer wave. It's such a broader canvas. It's much more about performing. And I'd imagine that a number of the surfers would even be using different equipment when you have equipment that is exclusively for getting tubed, and then equipment that is not only for getting tubed, but also for doing incredible rail turns or fin-free maneuvers or even aerials that you may need to employ at waves like Cloud Break and restaurants. So I don't think it's a huge advantage in terms of getting reps. It may be an advantage in terms of your profile building, in terms of being confident, and in terms of getting a ton of support heading into Fiji. But I think in surfing, almost like we just kind of discussed with Gabe, it could also be a huge distraction, right? And it could be kind of psychologically taxing or just physically taxing. You have to do so many things at the Olympics. It's a different kind of an event. The judging is somewhat different. The format's going to be different. And it may just kind of be this weird outlier for them from a competitive standpoint that maybe they are a little bit shaken by the time they come to Fiji. I don't know. I think it's probably a wash at the end of the day. I don't know if it's a huge advantage or a disadvantage necessarily. But I don't know, Mitch, what do you think about surfers that are competing in the Olympics? Do you think they're going to have an advantage going into the final CT stop of the season in Fiji?
I think it depends on how much success they have at that event there. Like,
Sure.
Gabe is for sure one of the favorites going into that event. Can't forget about John also competing for the United States. Griffin's going to be on the team for the first time. I just want to highlight the people that aren't on the CT that eventually will make it there. Kali Vost is a freaking animal at that wave, dude. And
right.
you gotta watch out for that dude out there, man. Joan Duru also on the team for Team France, like former CT surfer, a guy who had major success on both the Challengers and the Championship Tour. I think when it comes down to it, it's more than anything repetition, like you're at
Right.
least getting that competitiveness still in there in a large gap because it's nearly 2 months of not competing at that level either, So I'd rather look at it as something positive for the people that will be competing at the Olympics on the Championship Tour, especially for Tati, who's in need of a desperate result. I think it's an important topic to talk on right now, Dave, because Tati hasn't been able to win an event so far this year. If she wins over there in Tahiti, her confidence and her motivation going into Fiji must be, sky high. And another big thing too is that they're going to be surfing against surfers that they don't normally see either, So they need to approach a lot of these heats as if it's the last one they're going to surf in their life, because you don't know how capable, how good a lot of these surfers are because you don't see them on a regular basis. So I think motivation wise for a lot of these surfers, it should be exactly the same whether at this event or in the next one. But to me, it just comes down to the amount of heats that they're going to be able to surf in terms of repetition. So it's a great question, by the way. Appreciate it. Jay Haley 87. Awesome question. One of the best we've had on our last few episodes. Okay, transitioning number 3, our final one, Dave. At Dan JC 264. Do you think the elimination round loss will throw off Sammy's rhythm going into South Africa? Talking about the Challenger Series right there.
Yeah, that's a great question, because we are heading into this 6-week gap on the championship tour, but we are moving into Ballito, which starts this week, the next stop on the Challenger Series. Sammy Pupo, who has been on the CT before, who's been impressive on the CT before, is currently leading the rankings on the Challenger Series. So it's a good question. Now, we talked about before, like the waves this season in Itauna, pretty challenging. So I don't think anyone should take away too much negativity if things didn't go their way in the heat. He went down in the elimination round to Griffin Colapinto. Not the result he wanted, but Griffin is a top 5 surfer. He's a great surfer, and as we said, the conditions make it a little bit of a crapshoot from this season. So I don't think it will impact him too much. I think getting the wild card into a CT when you're not on the CT, whether it's George Pitar or whoever, I think it's a bit gravy. It's on top of the job at hand, which for them is to perform well in the Challenger Series and to secure their full-time spot on the Championship Tour next season. So I don't think it'll have a negative impact on Samuel Pupo. But I don't know. Mitch, you certainly have competed at higher levels than I have, so I'm curious to get your take on this question.
Well, it's actually a great question because I feel like the emphasis that we had on the Challenger Series being a feeding system into both the Championship Tour and the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings has a great point right here. Want to highlight that he was having a great heat up until the point where Griffin took the lead in that one because Sammy was able to get his first 2 scores and his best 2 scores in the first 5 minutes of the heat. He's beating Griffin, who at that point did not have a great event so far and was able to make a big comeback, make it to the semifinals. There's no shame in that. And Sam was able to win the Challenger Series here last year. He was able to make the final at the CT level in 2022. I wouldn't look at it as a negative thing. I'd just be like, okay, like that kind of proved that I still deserve to be on the CT right there and that I'm more than capable of making it back. I already had a strong performance over there at Snapper Rocks on the Gold Coast, the first event of the Challenger Series season. I think he's still a favorite to win at both Ballito and in Huntington Beach. It's really the last event of the season over here in Saquarema once again that's going to be the tricky one for him. Is he going to be able to perform despite the lack of consistency that he had after Snapper and before that win too? So, I think with the forecast that we have going into Ballito, it's looking beneficial to him. But this kid has a lot of talent. I think he's going to be able to requalify at the end of the season, Dave, and he'll be on the CT beginning 2025 once again.
I agree. And even kind of gaming out, like we've talked about it from the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings perspective, and we've talked about it in a few episodes of JS Industries, Jason Stevenson out of the Gold Coast, his one of the best programs in the history of elite performance, and has been a relative non-factor in the last few years. His team kind of aged out of the CT, and they've been rebuilding. But even looking at the men's team this year, and Ryan Callanan, Samuel Pupo, Frederico Moraes, Ramsey Bukayam, getting them on tour and getting them in a place where they're confident to perform. We saw it. They're not one of the bigger programs, but they have hitters when they're on, and I think Sammy absolutely fits into that. But yeah, great question. And as Mitch said, thanks to everyone who wrote in at the lineup pod on social media. If we didn't get to your questions, we'll make sure we respond in the DM. So keep them coming, questions and comments. We appreciate them all. And Mitch, thank you so much for another episode. Great one. Safe travels back from Rio, and yeah, man, looking forward to talking soon.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate you, and hope everybody enjoys both the Olympics and the next event in Fiji because it's going to be a banger to finish off the year, Dave. Really looking forward to it.